Hi guys, welcome back to the course. So today we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at Google Ads audiences and some of the audience solutions that Google has within the interface. So there's lots of different ways to target an audience within Google Ads. We've got bid strategies, we've got insights that can help around kind of demographics, interests, things like that. We've got in-market audiences, all these different areas that we can look at. So it's really important that we utilise and put these audiences into practice when managing our Google Ads account. So when we think about audiences and the typical ways in which people search and buy these days, it's quite complex. And Google obviously is aware of this and has given us lots of options with audience insights and signals to help us, give and show our message, what they say is kind of at the right time and to the right person. So as a Google Ads expert that you are, you need to also kind of evolve with the expectations of what a customer requires and wants to see in order for them to interact with your business and at the end of the day become one of your customers. So one of the main things that you need to think about is obviously being highly relevant and of course being useful to the customer that you are trying to target. So a successful campaign will kind of work to make sure that the different audience segments are targeted in a personalised and relevant way and at each stage of the customer journey. So when you're creating your Google Ads account and Google Ads specific campaigns, you need to consider what your marketing goals are. So there's different stages that people will be at when you think about your potential customer, your audience that you're trying to reach. So you're going to have things like the awareness stage, you can have consideration, and you're going to have the conversion stage as well. So you need to think about your audiences in those ways and utilise the products that Google offers in order to engage best with those audiences. So if we take, for example, the awareness segment, some of the things that might come in useful from a Google Ads perspective when looking at an awareness campaign is things like the detailed demographics that they have within the system. So you can look at reaching people based on things like their age and gender, but also things like their marital status, parenting stage, home ownership and things like that, which is a bit more detailed and that allows you to reach an audience that you are trying to target in a bit more depth. And there's also the affinity audiences, which are really useful for awareness as well because they are Google's list of people who they have defined as demonstrating a very strong interest in a specific topic. So this is something that you could potentially overlay onto your campaigns in order to drive more awareness for your brand. Then when you consider something like the consideration period, things like your remarketing lists are going to be really useful. So obviously you can do RLSA, which is your remarketing list for search ads. So this is going to be reaching out and targeting those people who've obviously already previously engaged with your brand. So that might be, you might have a list built around anyone who's previously hit your website, or you might have really segmented lists around people who've hit specific parts of your website and have a targeted campaign or a group and messaging around those. There's also in-market audiences, which is kind of Google's predefined audiences that are available within the interface that show you a list of people who are what Google see as being in market to buy. So including those in a kind of consideration stage could also give you kind of some valuable targeting across your campaigns. And then you might also consider things like similar audiences. So these are audiences that are built from Google, and you can do similar to other lists that you've got. So similar audiences for search, for example, just lets you find new customers that have, well, it's in the name, similar characteristics or behaviours that you have already built from your remarketing audience segments. So they're a really useful thing to apply to campaigns from a further kind of reach perspective, to see if you can capture more people who already act like some of the customers who have been on your website previously. And then finally, if we think about, the conversion stage, again, there's a little bit of crossover, I guess, between kind of the consideration and the conversion stage, because things like your remarketing lists, especially, you're going to have, at a consideration stage and a conversion stage, you would expect that people who are, in those remarketing lists, because you've built them based on interacting with your website already or previously converting, things like that, you're gonna have those on your campaigns when people are ready to buy as well. But another really interesting option that you've got from Google is what's known as customer match data. And rather than it just being a list built based off people who've interacted with your website, for example, it is instead your internal data from the business that you can upload into Google and retarget to across when people are searching across the Google search engine. So that's really useful. So obviously there's a lot of different things you can do with audiences, and I would encourage you to play around quite heavily in the interface in terms of looking at the different options that you have. So I'm on the audience section here. If you wanted to add a new specific audience from kind of Google's predefined lists or a remarketing list, for example, it's really simple just to jump in and click on the add an audience option. Click a campaign, apply to my test campaign. And then what you've got to remember as well is there's two parts to audiences. So you've got your targeting and your observation. So observation is kind of in the name, in terms of it basically means that any audience that you apply to a campaign, it will observe it and show you data for that audience, so you'll be able to see insights into how that list or that audience performed against the rest of your account. And targeting means that you're only going to target that audience specifically. So if, for example, if we just pop down here, so this is some of Google's predefined lists. So let's say that we want an in-market audience, for example, because we're building a campaign and we want to focus on people who are, in the market to buy, and we are in the vehicles industry. I could apply this autos and vehicles in market list, and if I was to set this to targeting, this now means that whenever somebody searches for my keyword, they'll only be shown my ad if they fall into Google's predefined audience in market list of in market for autos and vehicles. So anybody else who falls outside of this list won't be shown my ad. Whereas if I shift to the observation mode, it just means that in my reporting section on the interface, I'll be able to see how people who fall into the autos and vehicles in market list perform in comparison to people who fall outside of it. So it'll give me insight into it. So typically what we tend to do is you want to kind of layer your campaigns with a load of audiences that you feel would be relevant in observation mode, so you can kind of analyze and understand how they perform. And when you've got some further insight into those and you've got some data to back what your thoughts would be around those audiences, you can then start to create targeted campaign and really drill down into those audiences, so that your campaign is very tailored and specific and should be driving you much more efficient conversions based on the data that you've learned. So previously, before we pushed more into Google automated bidding strategies, there was a lot of things you could do with audience in terms of, you might increase your bids on certain audiences, for example. So you might layer up these audiences and apply, I don't know, a 10% uplift to orders and vehicles because that audience had been working particularly well, or you might decrease a certain audience rather than excluding it. You may just say, I just want to downweight a little bit. But obviously, depending on what bidding strategy you're using, if you're still kind of working with a manual CPC, then that way of working will work fine. That's great. But obviously, if you're working with some of Google's automated bidding strategies that, for example, might be target CPA, Google's machine learning should already be optimizing these audience lists for you as part of the automation process, and using audience signals to show to these audiences already at the right times based on your campaign goal that you've assigned in line with your bid strategy. So I think it's really important that you continuously monitor and expand your audience lists to understand, how they perform. It is worth potentially trying, really targeted audience specific campaigns as a test to see how they work in comparison to appearing to, like you say, all people who do a search for your keyword. You can do an experiment just to see how that works. I would just recommend always constantly testing with PPC is the main key, especially. So with your audiences, just to finish off applying them here, so if we go through and kind of click, this orders and vehicles, I can click save and apply that, and that's in observation mode now. So this is what I mean when we talk about observation. You'll see this audience list here, and over time when you start generating data, you'll see the performance of the audiences, and then you'll see total other or total account, and this is where you'll see people who fall outside of this audience, and you can start determining whether or not this audience works better than people who fall outside of it, for example. Or if you were to add multiple different audiences, so if I go in and create multiple different ones, I'll do a campaign level one, sorry. I'm just going to pick a load of different audiences, and remember when they're on observation mode as well, there's no harm in adding ones that you're a little bit unsure of whether or not they're relevant to your business or not, because you're not targeting them in any way, you're just observing them. So I could literally just go in and add all these different audiences if I wanted to, just to get a really broad understanding. There we go, save, apply those, and then in time when the data populates, I'll be able to say, okay, so out of these audiences, which one resulted in the best click-through rate, which one resulted in the best conversions for me, what had a more efficient cost per conversions or a higher conversion rate, etc. And you might start understanding, okay, education isn't an audience that works well for me, I'm going to exclude it, or I found out that consumer electrics works really well in comparison to other audiences, I'm going to have a targeted campaign specifically just for people who fall into the consumer electronics in-market audience, for example. And like you said, there's multiple different audiences that you can have. So these are examples of in-market audiences, depending on the aim of your campaign, what your marketing objective is. If you're doing awareness, if you're doing consideration, if you're doing conversion, whatever it might be, you've got all these different areas. So browse, and you can go into things like what we talked about earlier, like affinity audiences. So these are topics. And the breakdown more granularly as well. So these are the top level topics, but if you click on the arrow here, it gives you a little bit more detail into what those topics are. So media and entertainment, that covers movie lovers and book lovers, for example. So you might be a bookshop and you might want to apply an affinity category. So it's going to be more relevant to you potentially to target book lovers than it is movie lovers, but you might want to target all of them. So you might include media and entertainment, or you might go through and click through and add these all in individually so you can see the insights into these more granular layers as well. So what you'll see now is, rather than just having the top level segment, you'll have media entertainment, gamers, then you have media and entertainment, movie lovers, etc. And you'll be able to see the insight and audience performance of these individual audience categories as well. So following on from kind of Google's audience solutions, I just wanted to give a little bit insight into how Google categorizes their audiences. So we've talked about applying audiences, in-market, affinity audiences, etc. But what do these actually mean, and how did Google determine who falls into an audience, for example? So if you think of something like an affinity audience, there's multiple different ones out there. It might be, people who are, interested in the outdoors, for example. So Google collects data, and as we're aware, obviously Google's the biggest search engine. It has unlimited data going through it. So it basically uses kind of machine learning to understand, people who, for example, might have searched about, hiking trails, for example, or where to go camping, or what's the best app for creating routes on a new walk, things like that. They'll collect those kind of data, and their system basically recognise that that person who's searching for all these different things is probably interested, and or if it's an affinity audience, might be passionate about the outdoors. And then they would pop those into an affinity audience that's about the outdoors. So if we look at the affinity audiences again, we'll just look at affinity audiences, and you can search for a different category as well. So if we do a search here and type in outdoors, we can see, for example, there's these different audiences. We've got in-market audiences, but if we're thinking about topics and affinity, if you scroll down, you should get to an affinity segment. So there we go, outdoor enthusiasts. And then basically if you hover over this as well, it'll give you more insight into what this audience means. So top related audiences: off-road vehicles being used, boating and sailing enthusiasts. YouTube categories include things like campers and bike parts and things like that. So basically Google's identified people who fall into these different areas, do these different searches, watch these different videos, etc., are probably going to fall into people who like the outdoors. So if you were a company who, sold bikes, for example, bike helmets, off-road bikes, all that kind of stuff, you'd potentially want to have this affinity audience as an audience within your targeted campaign. And it works like that across kind of all the ways that it works. So you've got the in-market segment as well. So let's say that somebody searched for, fashion. See if anything pops up for fashion. So we've got, for in-market, we've got formal wear, we've got suits and business attire, we've got children's apparel. So there's quite a lot of things that would fall into fashion. But it's got quite a few different segments that we can target, and probably something that's going to be relevant to your business. So let's just say, for example, you are a company that sells suits and prom style dresses and things like that. You're probably going to fall into this formal wear category section. And what you'll see here is the typical people in this audience, top related audience searches, things like bridal wear, wedding planning, suits and business attire. That's going to be really relevant to you. So that's an example of an in-market audience. So it is very clever technology from Google in terms of, they've built these audiences off the back of how people search and learnings over time that had to collate this data, and these people typically fall into this segmented audience. So, when we're talking about applying audiences and utilising this information, it is important to understand what goes behind it, and it is data collected, and it's not just random things that have been pulled together in a hope that that you'll apply them to your campaign, it'll be relevant. There is the high chance that if you apply one of these audience lists that are predefined from Google, that your audience will sit within it. I just wanted to also make a note about, obviously, the automated bidding that Google has. So conversion based strategies, so like target CPA and things like that. Although Google will automatically optimize towards the audiences, I would still recommend that you have these audiences applied to your campaigns, at least in an observation mode, to have a look at what's going on, and potentially segment them in the future as well into specific targeted campaigns with the overlay of the bid strategy as well. So that's an insight into Google Ads audiences. I hope it's helpful. I hope you've got an audience in there that you search for and you feel is relevant and can apply to your campaigns. Like I say, get adding them in observation mode anyway, start learning about who your audience are, start learning about what different segments they sit within, and keep learning.